Welcome everyone to the Edward S. Curtis in Hollywood presentation by local independent historian Dan Kerlee. He was kind enough to work with us here at the Magnolia Library to create an ephemera display in our lobby area. We've had great interest in this display, and we did a concurrent display on old Hollywood and Edward's work in Hollywood at that time. Very popular, moved lots of books, so if you have any questions about that, come ask me at any point in time. My name is Meadow. I want to welcome you all here to the library today, and I'm not going to talk about Dan as much as Dan knows about himself. So, but thank you all for coming. I'm very excited for you to see Edward Curtis in Hollywood today.
Well, yes, thank you everyone for coming out, especially on a day with weather like this. Just to introduce myself a little bit to those of you that don't know me, I am Dan, and I'm Magnolia here. That's great. We've got another couple people. That's wonderful. I'm just to introduce you to me a little bit. I guess I'm a software engineer by profession, but a classical musician by training. I do a little bit of work in public history in our area, and I've got many years of study of photography, which is represented in the aype.com website about our exposition in 1909. My work in music and silent film is through the Henry Hadley website. Hadley was an early conductor of the Seattle Symphony, very important in silent film music, which sort of broadened my interests into silent film. This particular year happens to be the celebration of the 150th anniversary of Edward Curtis's birth. And this is one of many activities that we've had in the city this year. But this sort of brings my interests together, and that's why this particular topic for me. So, without further ado, we can plunge in here, but our time is a little bit limited, so I'm going to try to get through this material. They need us out of here at 8 o'clock. But if you can certainly write to me at these websites if this is of interest, further interest, you want more detail on some of these things I'm going to push through kind of quickly. And if there's enough interest, I don't anticipate it, but if someone wants to talk more, we can certainly go over to the pub afterwards. Okay, so forgive the peepers here, if you will, but welcome to Edward Curtis in Hollywood. There's probably at least 75 books written about Edward Curtis and his work, probably even more than that. And Edward Curtis started in Seattle, but he spent nearly a third of his life based in Los Angeles. And he was actively involved with Hollywood's film industry over a period of 15 years. But there doesn't seem to be much that's been presented or exhibited on this period of his life. There's some good reasons for this. His life's work was the North American Indian, and he didn't try to preserve and document his day job work with the same care. It's difficult in many cases to identify his work, so it's not easy to dig into this Hollywood material, and yet with a little sleuthing, enough is available to add some detail. Certainly, though, he applied all of his professionalism and creativity to everything that he did in the early 1920s, when the future of the North American Indian and his own career were uncertain. And I'd just like to acknowledge that we're fortunate that numerous collectors and institutions have loaned material for us to enjoy tonight. So, I'm assuming that many of us are very familiar with Curtis's work, and others are not at all. So, we'll try to lay a little bit of background here. His greatest work, the 20-volume North American Indian, has engendered a great deal of discussion, especially over his pictorialism. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But the main issues refer to trying to create something just beyond the facts in his photographs, but to create works of art. It's a complex area. Let's look at these two beautiful examples. Both of these convey so much of the spirit of native life. And you have to realize that in the North American Indian, he published over 2,500 images. The one on the left is from the North American Indian. Curtis has been criticized for staging his images. In the picture on the left, the woman is wearing a great deal of potlatch regalia, which she might have normally only worn at festivals, not when she was working. And likewise, although signal fires were important to Apache culture, this may not have been an actual ritual. So this is a whole complex area. We're going to kind of sidestep that. It's been discussed a lot of times this year, and look at Curtis, the artist. But as he got started in the early 1900s, Curtis's financial situation was always shaky. And he received major funding from the financier J. Pierpont Morgan, but Morgan passed away in 1913, about 10 years into the project. So here's a quick little selected timeline of events that sort of give us some context for the Hollywood part of Curtis's career. 1904, the great train robbery, one of the first sort of feature films. 1911, Hollywood got started as a film center. Prior to that, it had been in the Northeast primarily. So 3 years later, in 1914, Curtis produced the first full-length feature documentary. It was an artistic triumph, but it was a financial disaster. But it still made news throughout the industry. And the same year, Cecil B. DeMille, hopefully a name that most of us recognize, produced his first silent features and made 60 minutes the standard for his films. Just 1 year later, 1915, The Birth of a Nation is released. This is a famous film. A lot of discussion around it politically that we'll have to not have time to discuss, but nevertheless, it is a landmark of film history. So we can see that Curtis had really been near the forefront of innovation at this time. However, by 1919, Curtis was in big trouble. He moved out of Seattle to Los Angeles. He opened the new studio with the help of his daughter. And in 1920, the roaring 20s bring a lot of changes, investment, dreams, very big impact on film and all of society. 1922, Curtis is hired to go to work on DeMille films as both a still and a moving photographer. By 1926, the whole industry has changed with the advent of sound. But in 1922, Jack Pierpont Morgan Jr. reinstated funding for the North American Indians. So we can see we've got a little period in his life that's unique. So in 1919, the divorce, Morgan's death, left Curtis without a studio or an income. He moved to Hollywood, set up a new studio, did portrait work, participated in silent films. And so when he arrived in Los Angeles, he basically was doing everything that he'd done before. You can see some of the many areas, but he added some new things. Here's a current look at the building where Curtis got started in Los Angeles, but he would not stay there very long. Curtis's daughter Beth came to Los Angeles with him and helped set up and manage this new studio, and so she remained a faithful business manager, photographic assistant, traveling companion, helpful supporter for the rest of his life. And under her care and the photographic skill of her eventual husband, the Curtis studio blossomed. It's worth noting that Curtis was as much a director as he was an artist, and so many persons were involved in running his enterprise. When we think of this massive set of works, there were a lot of people involved. He was behind the camera, but there was text, music, and other things. But he was the genius behind it all, and he was developing most of the techniques used. Okay, so he threw himself into the social life of Los Angeles. And this has been a bitter divorce. 3 years of exhausting struggle for him. But he threw himself right in. He shows up in the news in a lot of ways on the social columns. Here he's giving Christmas suggestions to people. We can guess what that was. He's honored here, though, in a more serious kind of a reception at the Wawan Club. This Wawan translates to sing to someone. It was a very important women's literary and musical society that did focus around Native American themes, Native American justice in its time, which was quite early. We also see that Henry Gilbert was in this presentation as well. So these are important big names, Gilbert as an American composer. So he was making good use of those connections. In early 1921, here he is, he's listed as the president of a budding new film production studio with an ambitious name. Universal had already been taken, so Cosmos Art is chosen. This was a time of rapid growth and also consolidation in all kinds of industry across the United States, the film industry included. So money was flowing freely, there were all kinds of projects like this launched, but Curtis seems to have quickly turned from his executive position he turned it over to someone else. Cosmos Art, it got a neighborhood zone for a large production lot. It bought out the rights to a lot of titles and constructed a couple of buildings. But with the advent of sound film, it quickly restyled itself as a real estate corporation. It was trying to find industrial warehouse clients. However, it does seem clear that Curtis saw forming a full film production company as a possible goal. This is something that we haven't heard much about, really. He attempted to raise a lot of money, and the end goal of most of these projects, though, was to finance the North American Indian. North American Indian was a very expensive set of books early in the 20th century. I think it sold for $3,500. It's really something. So the potential commitment here for investment is almost $4 million. Now, I don't think he actually got most of his money paid in, but this shows you that he dreamed of the possibility of opening a full motion picture studio. Okay, and he exhibited and lectured just as much as he could. We don't know whether an exhibition of the portraits of 50 well-known people came together or not, but he solicited everyone with great confidence. So it's this idea of pictorialism in photography is a little hard to grasp maybe at first, but we'll kind of jump through it a little bit here. But Curtis was a little bit late in the pictorialism story, but it was a very big part of American art photography in the early 20th century. But we've also got the challenge of trying to identify which pictures Curtis actually took. We know in the North American he was behind the camera, but he had this studio that we've talked about, and a lot of it was being run by other people. So we're going to look at some portrait work first. How did we decide that it was a Curtis image? Well, partly by the subject. If it was a really important person, Curtis probably got involved with the picture. There's a degree of artistry, there's pictorialism in the image, and also sometimes we can match up to a specific film that we know he was a film photographer, not quite yet here. Okay, so here we have Anna May Wong. She's the most famous Chinese-American film actress of her day. She appeared in 55 silent and sound films from 1919 through her last television production in 1961. Just amazing. She was American-born, but she struggled against racial stereotyping in her roles, and yet when there was a really juicy Oriental role, she'd get passed over by a Caucasian actress. But many portraits over the years that were taken of her really attempt to emphasize an exotic, Oriental, just an overly sensual, sensationalist vamp, really. And here, her beauty is shown in an image of power and dignity. This one is very typical of Curtis in that the props really help frame the portrait. They create a lot of additional interest. Here, the actress really becomes the greatest of several props. So this is a still life with a living focus. This is Mary Pickford. Mary Pickford, she had a career as an actress, producer, and studio executive that spanned over 50 years, known as American Sweetheart. She appeared in 219 silent shorts and features, 15 sound films, helped create United Artists Studio. So here in her portrait we see soft focus, we see her full length view, minimalistic background, and she's in motion. So here Curtis has the freedom to engage fully in his artistic, pictorialist inspiration, unfettered by the constraints of the costume. Will Rogers, one of the best-loved entertainment personalities of all time in American stage, film, and radio, 36 silent, 21 sound films, a dozen travelogues, but he was a quarter Cherokee. He was born in the Cherokee Nation, and he identified as Cherokee. But amazingly, he represents homespun Americanism through his humor and commentary, so popular today. He liked to joke that his ancestors didn't come over on the Mayflower, but they met the boat. So it seems fair to attribute this sitting to Curtis. We've got a very famous man here. It's a hand-signed print, and it was actually prepared for the mayor of Beverly Hills. Well, I like to talk about this image a little bit. It does a wonderful job of revealing depth of personality, dry humor, built out of the many life experiences that he had. And the lighting adds drama. The clasped knee gives warmth and accessibility. It's a wonderful portrait. But I also wanted to show this image in the presentation because here in King County we have a special Will Rogers connection. He was very interested in commercial aviation and promoting it in our country. And so he played his last polo game at the Lake City, the Olympic Polo Grounds in Lake City in 1935. He took off the next day with Wiley Post, the famous aviator, in a float plane to go up to Alaska. They were going to do mapping and all this sort of thing. 9 days later, they crashed fatally, and a real tragedy in many ways. But here in our area, we have a monument to Will Rogers at Lake City, and there's also a seaplane-based name for him in Renton. So a little local thing there. Here we have Sally Rand, famous dancer. You might recognize her name better as the fan dancer in the 1930s. She was famous, she was notorious. She never really revealed much. She would get arrested and quickly released. Very famous dancer of his time. But here we see all these pictorialist aspects, trying to create something beyond just a mere photograph or portrait of her. We've got soft focus, all this wonderful use of shadow, this elegance of line, and this vase, which was a very Curtis sort of a feature to add to his portraits. And so it's possible to look at him, I would say in this case, not as a romantic as he's often been accused of, but as a classicist because he's got Sally Rand as a classical statue. Okay, here we have director-producer Lawrence Trimble. This one's signed in ink by Curtis. Trimble created the character of the very first canine superstar, Strongheart. And Strongheart was born in Germany. He was discovered by Trimble. And although he died in a filming accident, unfortunately, in 1929, nearly 90 years later, he's actually still very popular. You can buy a book about him at Target today. And there's still a dog food with his picture on it that you can get. It even has its own Facebook page. So this image of Strongheart comes from a special album that Trimble had full of Strongheart photography, and you see that here we have sepia and this very Curtis-like image. Here's more evidence for this being Curtis's work scattered through this album. You see there's North American pictures and so forth. Okay, Sid Grauman. He's familiar to many of us as the builder of Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood, where the plaza is filled with handprints and footprints of the stars. He actually kind of got his start selling newspapers during the Gold Rush in the Klondike. But he first, before he built the Chinese Theater, he built his Egyptian Theater 2 blocks to the east down Hollywood Boulevard. And this is an image from Grauman's personal papers, signed by Curtis. And here's another image that came with it of the Egyptian's interior. It's just so very Curtis-like in this artistic treatment of architecture and the way that the human figure is scaled against this massive landscape. Now this theater is still standing. It was the scene of many important premieres in the early days of Hollywood, and it's been highly remodeled though, and this architecture doesn't exists for the most part, but it's one of the most important art film theaters in the country today. So in this little segment, we just want to point out that Curtis was involved with important people and trying to express his art in this fashion. Here's another aspect of his work that was more experimental. Here's Aphrodite. It's Curtis's most famous work outside of the North American Indian. And it was sold in pretty good numbers, actually. It's printed in kind of different styles. But here we see Romanticism coming through unfettered. There was no reason for him not to be that way. This is a dreamy, impossible setting, of course. It's a double exposure. It suggests both water and clouds. It's really an exposure of the sea laid over this woman. Of course, Curtis is honoring other artistic traditions here. He's not just trying to be a documentarian. Of course, the reclining nude and so forth. This is always going to be a popular Curtis image. He was influenced by many other artists. Here we have Maxfield Parrish, and you see the castle up there. Here's another of what we call the Aphrodite series, Castle in the Sky. See the way the beautiful flowing of the lines and the dreamy image. This one, Sunset Trail, is very interesting. We see the sea sort of competing with the subject here, but they're both brought together by the reflection of light. And there's also this wonderful parallelism in the lines. These blue images, incidentally, are not cyanotypes, if anyone's used to that term. These are regular silver prints that have been toned to a blue color. This is a very rare image from the Aphrodite series. If you weren't some sort of Curtis specialist, you might never have seen it before. We're lucky to have the loan of it. Once again, we see how very nicely he's balanced the angles to make what looks like a simple photograph really work like a beautiful piece of art. We've got this wonderful use of dark space too, like Rembrandt. Okay. So the Rubaiyat is one of these great artistic might-have-been stories from Hollywood's silent era. Rubaiyat was the child of Ferdinand Penny Earle. And Earle was a fine artist, and he decided to tell this classic Oriental poetic story with nearly 300 painted backdrops in place of normal location shots. So you can see we had one ambitious man about to engage another one. These paintings ranged in size from about 8 by 10 inches to like 10 by 12 feet. And this was the first major film to have all of the action take place against backdrops. So a really big project that Curtis was hired to participate in. Earle just surrounded himself with the best talent available, and Curtis was engaged because of his fame and because of his work in Land of the Headhunters, and because he really understood the way that still photography and motion photography worked together. Something we don't have a lot of time to talk about, but it's a very interesting area. This is an image of Fredrickson working. And an early preview of this film was shown to critics, and they raved about it, but there were problems. Fredrickson's ego, money problems, it just never came quite together. But it was a boon to Curtis's Hollywood career. He shot 500 stills for Rubaiyat and exhibited 50 in his studio over there in Rampart, as we saw. So this was the first exhibition of movie stills as art objects in the United States. They were reviewed. A suite was published in the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and they were seen by producer Cecil B. DeMille. So it was finally recut and released into a shorter film, The Lover's Oath. Curtis, actually critics were sad when they saw The Lover's Oath, the ones who'd seen the original Rubaiyat. But in the process of working on this and the recut version, Curtis inspired the work of a younger still photographer, in fact someone who wanted to become a still photographer. And so he was also mentoring at the same time that he was developing his style. The story gets tangled. The competing director launched another Rubaiyat project. He hired Curtis to work on that one as well. This is a scene from Omar the Tent Maker. You can see how much influence of the earlier Rubaiyat is there. But Curtis's work made its way to the public eye even when he wasn't credited. Here is in an ad. Now, there's a very curious and interesting group of Curtis signed prints that exist from this period. They've been cropped out of stills. We don't really know what movie they're for, but they're all hand signed. They appear to be have been designed for major, or at least for some kind of exhibition. Okay, so his work with Rubia brought him to Cecil B. DeMille's attention and led to an engagement helping with Adam's rib. This is not the Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn version that some of us might be familiar with. That didn't happen for another decade, but it's a romantic farce. It was released in 1923. But Curtis's involvement is clear. He produced his own prints from the film. He wasn't the only still photographer, though, for the film, and so we have to decide which is his and which isn't. This one, this image, it might be partly a composite image, but it certainly seems to represent the intensity of his work and the drama that he liked to show. The film is very interesting. It includes a loosely connected, lengthy subsection, and it's tied into the plot through a paleontologist who's somehow attractive to the daughter of this dissatisfied wife, who's another key player. So anyway, the daughter is playing around on dinosaur statues, and the whole thing drops into this extended Neanderthal jungle scene. And here's where the romantic leads explore their inner fantasies without the restraints of modern culture. It's pretty crazy. But anyway, this is a signed Curtis image. This is a gold tone. We don't have time to talk much about gold tones, but this is the only known gold tone, although two prints are known. These gold tones are a famous part of Curtis's work, where the image is actually printed on the back of the glass. There's gold in the emulsion, gold behind it. Too bad we don't have a little more time to talk about it. Here's another example from Adam's rib. He signed and published these in blue tone. But shortly after the release of Adam's rib, Paramount makes this stunning announcement about this upcoming epic, and Curtis is listed right here. Cecil B. DeMille first made the Ten Commandments in 1923 as a silent film. We might not all be familiar with that. This is not the sound version with Charleston Heston that we all know from 1956. We could have another whole program just on Cecil B. DeMille and the Ten Commandments. DeMille conceived it as a deeply moralistic tale in the tumultuous mix of post-World War I guilt and grief. He felt something was needed addressing, and he made this clear through the rest of his life. He kept coming back to the Ten Commandments, wrote a book about it, everything else. Very interesting. Okay, we're fortunate to have a number of Ten Commandments images to work with, printed them in blue tone, sold his own copies on paper mounts with a studio name. The interesting thing about this Ten Commandments is that it's actually two movies in one. You might say two stories. Half of it is the biblical story, or something close to it anyway, and half of it is a modern telling. They had a huge cast, over 2,500 actors and actresses creating these massive scenes. And this is an area where Curtis was known to have some skill in doing these large outdoor scenes. So trying to add authenticity to the film, DeMille brought in hundreds of Jewish actors from Palestine. And the Palestine women immediately claimed Estelle Taylor, who was playing the role of Miriam, as one of their own. They said she has to be Jewish. It's just great. But DeMille was not afraid to take some dramatic license with the Exodus story when it added to the drama. The worship of the golden calf is one of the wildest scenes of the film, and a few negatives that Curtis kept for his own printing have come down to us, and they help us identify scenes that he was involved with. So we really know that this one's Curtis. Silent films were made in a much different way than sound ones. Directors could shout, music could be playing, actors could spice up their lines. DeMille hired a small orchestra to entertain the extras and music, along with filming after hours. So it was a rare shot of behind-the-scenes action. The second half is a fairly stock 1920s melodrama, and it emphasizes not only the repercussions of sin, but also of unforgiving religiosity. So here, Mrs. Martha McTavish prays earnestly. John McTavish confronts his unbelieving brother Dan across the table, and Mary Leigh, who's really just relieved to have a warm meal, tries to find her place amid all the tension. Both Mrs. McTavish and Dan will have to be sacrificed for DeMille to make his point. Pretty crazy. But once again, Curtis, the drama capturer, even in this film. So sometimes we have to take whatever we can get on these prints. There's very little from the last half that we can identify as Curtis, but this one's got the intensity in the drama, and it seems like a real possibility. But he was also hired as a cameraman on this film. What motion picture footage did he shoot? We have no real way of knowing. He was working as a second unit cameraman. That meant that he was helping out with the big scenes where they needed multiple angles. He's picking up small pieces of the action with the less engaged characters. So I've chosen one of the big dramatic scenes of the film where it seems like at least somewhere he might have been shooting. And take a look also at these really long shots with literally thousands of extras. Something there that Curtis shot. But they don't make them like they used to. Okay, it's possible that Curtis might have worked on other film productions. This scene is not from one of his known projects, but it was printed and sold by him during his blue period, I guess. There's just a lot of research yet to be done, and many discoveries that we hope to make. Okay, well, around the time of the release of the Ten Commandments, Curtis received full funding again for continuing the North American Indian. And the article title here does represent the Los Angeles Times staff, not Curtis. Curtis was very respectful of Native Americans. But this is interesting. Here, this is a scene of Crater Lake, but it's a retake of another image that he made 20 years previously. He lost the rights to his negatives in the divorce. The ones that were in the North American Indian were kept by Pierpont. He didn't have the rights to them necessarily. And so he had to sneak in, but this is a gold tone from Los Angeles. In 20 years previously, the Native American appears on the other side of the image. But he went back out, went back in the field, got the work done. He went far north. His trip to the far north was beset with dangers and injury even, but he yielded great images such as this one of a young woman in the Bering Sea. So the North American Indian was finally completed in 1930. But the Morgan estate kept everything, all the copies of the books. He was originally supposed to get 100 sets to sell or something like that. He got no further payment. And then the Great Depression was on. So as he later said, Curtis said, I devoted 33 years to gathering material. When I was through, I didn't possess enough to buy a ham sandwich. He was ill at times. He worked in other enterprises. And things were kind of tough. But he is credited as a participant in The Plainsmen, probably took some stills. And his full role may not be fully known. And in some ways this is a strange film for Curtis to be involved with. However, it does pieced together a number of events and plot inventions together that lead up to the Battle of Bighorn, Little Bighorn. And Curtis had studied the battle intensively. He'd interviewed Native American leaders and their participants, and he wrote his own version of events about the Battle of Little Bighorn, and that was considered authoritative and radical even at the time. So we have to conclude that he was involved. He was used as a consultant about details surrounding the battle, as well as perhaps taking films. So we don't really know the extent of what he did. This film would have needed a second unit cameraman for all the big action shots. But I thought that Curtis would have appreciated this little moment that I'll show you, that it's between Calamity Jane, who's portrayed by Jean Arthur, and Wild Bill Hitchcock, who's played by Gary Cooper.
Bill!
Hello, Calamity.
Oh, Bill. Gee, you're back. I've been watching and asking, and nobody's seen you. Nobody's
Well, I
heard
haven't been out in what you call society. I had one caller, though, Bill Cody.
Oh, he found you then. Say, Bill, you didn't...
No, he's all right. I'm meeting him here.
I'm sure glad of that. Wasn't your fault, them 3 soldiers getting killed. Say, Bill, you won't have to move on, will you?
No, I've got a hunch this is going to be my last camp.
You mean you're settling down? You're going to stay here?
I got a feeling I'm going to stay here.
So the West was changing, that's for sure. Okay, in 1938, in Hollywood's usual way, a complete set of the North American Indian was purchased by Paramount. And so perhaps Curtis was a consultant in absentia for this film. But possibly he was unable to help further, unfortunately, just due to his health problems that he had. So our direct references to his Hollywood film work end here. It's not known how this set of books continued to be used. The Curtis studio continued to thrive. It opened facilities in the prestigious new Biltmore Hotel and the Huntington Hotel in Pasadena. And many, many weddings and other portraits were taken here over the years, but not by Curtis. It would seem that his financial support for the rest of his life mainly came from the studio at this point. He had other things he tried out, like gold mining and so forth, but they just didn't pan out. But his last major public exhibit during his lifetime occurred in 1932 in Los Angeles. Also that year, a Los Angeles book dealer offered a set of the North American Indian along with his rare book offerings. But although he was not in the public eye to the degree that he had been, he was far from forgotten. He shows up in notices of exhibits on a regular basis around the country. And given what's readily available, he was certainly well known to librarians and book dealers and collectors and students of Native American life, at least the ones that were able to find copies of his work at that time. Very interesting here, in 1943, a set of his books, which sell for millions of dollars today, were donated. It would be interesting to know more about this and why it occurred at this particular time in the middle of World War II, but this aligns perfectly with everything that's documented about Senator Barry Goldwater's career. This is our Captain Goldwater. And the Salem Public Library was also instrumental by the late 1940s in maintaining contact with Curtis, getting him to write down details of his life. A very important contribution to the study of Curtis's life. So, in the year before his death, Edward Steichen chose a print from 2.5 million examples by American photographers to display it as one of 25 in a special exhibit at the New York Museum of Modern Art. And his photograph was acknowledged by critics as a work of real significance. So Edward Curtis's work had come full circle as he was acknowledged by one of the most famous practitioners of American pictorialist photography in the 20th century. So although he lived alone in this last decade of his life, Curtis's late years were not without family comfort. And here he appears in a family gathering with a famous Canyon de Chelly gold tone for backdrop. He passed away in 1952, but interest in his work revived in the 1970s, and today he's the most discussed Native American photographer. And his great-grandson, John Graybill, continues his legacy of art photography of land and peoples of the West. So that pretty much concludes our story of his Hollywood years. But thank you very much for coming, and if there's any questions, we've got 10 or 15 minutes here even to discuss anything you might want to know.
Well, first of all,
Yes.
a friend of mine has a copy of the Aphrodite one,
Yes.
and she thinks that she read somewhere that the model was his daughter.
There has been speculation about that. In fact, I talked to John Graybill about this. It stems from some conversations that now deceased members of the family had with authors in the 1970s. I'm skeptical of the notion, except I guess I don't know why not. It's a very interesting point to raise. I don't have a fully factual basis for either confirming or denying that, but it is, I guess it's possible. What John Graybill has said was that it would not have been Beth. It would have been one of the other daughters. In fact, I think the one who's sitting down in front would have been the more likely candidate to be the model. I guess it's entirely possible.
Thank you.
We have time for a few more questions. I am very curious, if you don't mind, how many people were even familiar with Edward Curtis at all before coming here? So good. So I hope I've added to your depth of knowledge about Edward Curtis, because this doesn't get covered very much. For the rest of us, I hope you get a chance to see some of the exhibits that are still remaining. Curtis's sesquicentennial will continue to be produced and shown throughout, I think, the March or April. There's a wonderful show right now at the Convention Center through the end of the year, showing the way that his lantern slides, his hand-colored lantern slides, would have been projected in full size. And you can find more information on beyondtheframe.org about exhibits all over. Okay, well, thanks. Oh, yes, we have
My
another more
neighbor
question.
used to be, he was Bill Coburn. He was played for all the silent movie features. And I
Yes.
was a roommate of Spencer McFarlane for about 2 years. Were you in Hollywood about that time? During the Our Gang comedy?
Was I in Hollywood?
Yeah.
Or was Curtis in?
Either.
Yeah, I certainly wasn't there.
You're not buckwheat.
Yes, Curtis would have been there during the silent Our Gangs. It's hard for me to put a year right on them, but I think that they are maybe just slightly later. It's interesting how year by year things change so quickly from the late teens through the 1920s. You know, in 1923, they're making The Ten Commandments. It's a landmark film. In 1926, the first sound movie is already with us. It's just amazing. I think that and Curtis himself, as soon as he got money to go back to work on the North American Indian, he was kind of out of there until he came back broke. So I think that probably Curtis and the Our Gangs don't quite overlap, but it's just by a matter of a year or two. Yes?
Well, I just wanted to recommend the book by Timothy Egan, Seattle's own
Yes.
Timothy Egan,
Yeah.
Short Nights of the Shadow Catcher.
Thank you.
Really a good book.
That's right. If you want to read one book to sort of expose you to his life,
And it's an easy read, too.
it's a wonderful read. That's correct. I guess.
And if you want to see a lot of his
We got a question back
photos,
here.
a lot of his prints, sorry.
Dan, can you tell us a little bit about this collection of books that he
that he worked his whole life for? How many books were there? And
Yes, it's an
how many
amazing.
copies were made? And
Well, let's see, how many copies were made? I knew someone was gonna stump me on something. It was a relatively
That was my
small
goal.
number. They were sold by subscription. Eventually, there were 20 leather-bound volumes of text and 20 portfolios of images along with them. The whole thing, you know, is like this wide. It's considered by some to be the greatest set of books ever produced. It was produced on subscription, and I think to get the whole set cost $3,500. You know, they launched this thing at the turn of the century, so it's very expensive. Even libraries were, in major areas, were unable to purchase sets of these things, and that's why a donation, as Captain at the time Goldwater did, was a really significant thing. We're fortunate here in the city. I think that there's actually 3 sets that are now available. They're not quite as available. My understanding is back in the 80s, you could go and they just bring them out and you could start flipping through them. They're treasured more as rare books now. But they're also, and I hope this maybe gets a little bit at another question that was bubbling over here. There are also wonderful books that reproduce these images. Hundreds, well not hundreds, but dozens of books, probably 100 titles if you count all the ones in foreign languages. And so, along with Timothy Egan's text, it's often very nice to get the Barbara Davis book is a great book, the Cardozo book. Did you have another book to
Well, the
recommend?
Chihuly Machine Museum has a whole wall of Curtis prints.
That's right.
The
Sure.
unfortunate thing is, it's the whole wall. So unless you have binoculars, you can't see the ones up there.
But it's
he was a
a
collector.
wonderful point. Chihuly, a great Curtis fan, influenced some of the glasswork that he did and so forth. Yes.
When I went to the exhibit that was at the Seattle Art Museum
Yes.
earlier this year, I noticed so many of the pictures have these beautiful frames. They were
Yes.
quite unusual. Now I see that they were on several of your slides. Do you know
Yes.
anything about those frames?
I'm sorry?
Do you know anything about those frames?
Well, I could talk about them. I don't know actually who produced these frames. Actually, Mike, by any chance, do you know who actually made?
I don't. It's known, but I don't know the name.
Yeah, this is an area that has a great deal of depth to it. Oftentimes they're called Batwing Frames, and I don't know if it comes out well enough there. If we could take maybe just a second and try to, let me see, how could we guess? How would we get back through these? Let's see if we can get back through some of these and get back to that gold tone. Since we have a moment here. Oh, don't start playing the movie again. Okay, well there's one right there. Yeah, these are these wonderful Batwing frames. You know, they're gilded, they're carved wood, there's some plaster maybe in the Batwing part. And they are definitely a hallmark. These, you have to realize that Curtis's North American Indian work, you know, it spanned over a generation. He started in the early 1900s and he didn't finish until 1930. So he starts in the arts and crafts era, and this whole style of art, the frames, the look, the pictorialist aspect, this is all arts and crafts. And by the time the Depression hits, we're into modernity, you know, and there, you know, there just was not a market to sell more of the books at the time. And the Morgans had invested far, far more money. They put $1.5 million into it back before World War I even. You know, that was a lot of money in those days, even for Pierpont Morgan. So they cut off any further funding to him, and his life was not easy. But he left us this wonderful legacy. The discussion around Curtis today, which was not supposed to be the point of this lecture, but I guess we got through the material. The discussion is, when we look at an image like this, does this somehow filter our view of Native Americans today, who are still struggling for rights, struggling against racial prejudice, struggling to have a modern identity in modern society, and yet be able to retrieve their roots. Sometimes, unfortunately, this turns into too much criticism when I think of Curtis, but it is the issue for us today as viewers of his work. You know, what is this what we are always going to want a Native American to be, and not a living, breathing person with rights and needs that need to be addressed at the present time? We don't have to address the needs of this Native American because he's no longer with us, you know, and he can represent a little bit of a dream to us. So this is where the discussion hinges, and it keeps Curtis's name very current. But it's also interesting, just to kind of tie it back into when he was in Hollywood doing film things, this was the perfect place for him to be. There's no questions of ethnology and journalism tying up the matter. You know, if someone's an actor, they can be wherever they want to be in that photograph. So it was a wonderful chance for him to express himself. So I think, yes, we need to.
So, once again, thank you once again. Really excellent. If you have further questions of Dan, I would invite you to speak with him off to the side. The library is closing in 15 minutes. The restrooms will be open for another 5. So if you need those, now is the time. Not in 1 minute or 2 minutes, but I would just go now. So thank you all. I appreciate it.